Welcome, everyone. This is the penultimate MarshWatch webinar. We're doing the big review today. This is going to be a little bit longer than usual because we are going to be covering off all of the bird and amphibian species as we go along. So, ooh, yay, my chat is still staying there. Okay, I'll be able to read the chat. I am broadcasting today from Saskatoon. We're located on Treaty 6 territory, encompassing the homelands of the Cree, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, Stoney, and Soto? Doing this one from memory, First Nations, as well as the homeland of the Métis people. And Saskatoon is a really gorgeous place. If you've never had the chance to come out and visit, I suggest you do. How do I advance again? There we go. My name is Leanne. I, of course, work for Birds Canada, a national not-for-profit organization. And one of the things we love to do is help teach people about birds. And this is what we're doing with MarshWatch. So super excited to be able to do this giant review with everyone. So the agenda for this evening, I have an announcement to make. I'll share the agenda for the final webinar that'll happen next week. And then we're going to review all of the species covered. That's going to be recorded and posted online. And then afterwards, we can discuss if you have any questions, etc. We can do all of that chat offline, not recorded, so you don't have to worry about asking questions that you don't feel comfortable asking if they're going to be recorded. Okay. First off, the announcements. I'm going to have to cancel all of the 2025 guided walks, as you may have seen in my email. On my skiing holiday, I suffered a pretty bad knee injury, so I won't be walking anywhere for the considerable future, at least not anything that's not just puttering around my house. So I apologize for that. I was really looking forward to the 2025 walks. They're a ton of fun to do, and it's always nice to, put faces to names and get you guys out and like doing this in person because there's nothing like doing it in person. I might still be able to do one in Saskatoon later in the season. We'll have to see how it progresses, or I might just have to borrow a wheelchair so that I can, get wheeled around. And if that's the case, I'll need some volunteers to carry some things for me. Anywho, so sadly, no guided walks this year, but if we do this again next year, which I'm confident we will, hopefully we can get all of those lovely walks done. So that's the big announcement. Next week, the agenda for that webinar, we'll just do a brief recap of why wetlands are important. I'm going to do a bunch of soundscapes, we'll review some of the plants, and then I'm just going to share with you some of the, kind of statistics on audience that we've, had in MarshWatch. This year has been outstanding in terms of, numbers of people tuning in, numbers of people watching the recordings. It's been fantastic. So we'll just go over a little bit of that as well next week. Okay. We have covered an awful lot of bird species. It doesn't feel like it, when we're doing a few at a time, but in total, we've covered 48 bird species throughout this webinar series. So that's pretty incredible. And I hope it didn't feel too overwhelming for you as we were going through it. I used to do a lot of webinars in person, traveling around, much of Saskatchewan. And because I was traveling, I couldn't go back 10 times to most places. So I would just kind of overwhelm people with a lot of bird species at once. So I think this is a far better way to do it. And, you build on your skill set as you go. We covered far fewer amphibians. We did, I think I didn't change 12. That might be 11 there. Anyway, we covered a good number of amphibians, so lots of frogs and toads as well. Okay. Before we get started, I know I've got the Canada Goose up here. I got a really great email today from someone asking why I haven't been giving like exact measurements and sizes for the birds, and I've just kind of left it sort of vague as large, medium, small. And that's because size is a really hard thing to get a good grasp on. There's all kinds of things that can affect how big or small a species might look, the things that are around it, if it's flying, how high up in the air it is, and especially if it's just, a single lone duck on a water body, how can you tell, the size of it? You're not going to be going up and measuring every duck that you see and go, oh, yes, this is within the range that Leanne or my field guide specified. So I've kept it kind of vague intentionally as like large, medium, small, and that's to emphasize other ID characteristics because I've seen an awful lot of people, you know, try to separate out, say, flycatchers and go, oh, well, this flycatcher is 2 centimeters bigger than this one, and I'm pretty sure it was big. I'm going, no, you can't tell that unless you have the bird in hand and you're measuring it. It's really, really tough to tell size. I've had weird perspective shifts where sometimes like, on the prairies, the trees look really small, but it's hard to tell sometimes. Like, are they really far away and tall, or are they close and fairly small? And so a robin can look huge on a small poplar, or it can look, rather tiny on a large tree. So perspective can really mess with you a little bit. So that's why I haven't been giving, exact measurements. So like the Canada goose, this is a large goose. So sorry for keeping it vague, but there is indeed a reason. And another thing before we get started, I just want to mention that in this review, I'm not going to be covering all of the features of each species. I'm really going to hone in on if it's a species that you're primarily going to identify by sight, we're just going to cover the visual characteristics. If it's one that you're almost never going to see, we're going to focus on the sound. I'll mention a few of the characteristics, but I'm really trying to break it down that way, and so we can keep it in somewhat of a tight time. And just to let you know what you can expect, it's much more worthwhile to learn the yellow rail call than to memorize what the bird looks like, because you're almost never going to see a species like that. So on each of the slides, I have little eyeballs and a little ear that kind of lets you know, okay, for this species, we're likely to hear it, and we're also likely to identify it by sound. So we'll get started with our very first here, the Canada goose. This is our large goose. They can be quite large, especially the species that nest in the south. There are different subspecies of Canada goose, and a lot of the ones that breed in the Arctic tend to be smaller bodied than the large ones that we often see, nesting in and around the southern parts of Canada. So they're quite large. They've got this gorgeous little white chin strap that stands out at a distance, and this is kind of an iconic Canadian species, one that you're all, I'm sure, familiar with, and of course has a lot of honking calls, which really harkens spring and fall migration. I really love hearing the geese go over. So here's the Canada goose call. And I'm sure I didn't share sound. Let me just rectify that for 1 second here. Maybe I can advanced sharing options. Nope. Okay, I'm gonna have to share sound. I can, oh, sweet. Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear this. Awesome. Okay. Oops, we somehow went backwards. Okay, so Canada goose, everyone's pretty familiar with that. Just play it one more time. Such a comforting sound when you have it going in the springtime. It's like, yes, spring is here, the geese are back, it's all good. Maybe not the case in places where geese spend the winter. Okay, I'm gonna head into the ducks now. And there's two major groupings of ducks, the dabblers and the divers. The dabblers feed on the water's surface, whereas the divers, you know, go below the water surface, dive under the water to get all of those, things that the dabblers can't get at, all the roots and tubers and mollusks and fish for the most part as well. So it's really, really helpful because your field guide is structured this way, and there's a lot of behavior clues. And even in the female ducks, the hens, there is plumage clues to help you start getting that separation down. So the dabbler species, they are the ones that tip up or feed at the water surface. So you'll see their little bums in the air, and you'll see their little, bills kind of om nom nomming right at the surface. They can dive small amounts, and they'll often do this when they're bathing, but there's the odd time they're like, I just want to get that plant, and they'll do that. But as a rule, they're staying on the water surface. These guys are able to walk around on land. So if you're seeing ducks wander around a park or feeding on waste grain in a field, they're going to be your dabblers. These are the guys that are really well adapted to walking around on land. The divers can do some walking, and indeed there's some species that are cavity nesters that do have to walk their little chicks from a cavity nest to the water, but on the whole, they're much more awkward. Their legs are set farther behind on their bodies. This is really great for underwater propulsion, less good for walking. They also have narrower wings compared to their body size. So they don't have as much lifting power. They can't shoot straight up from the water or straight up from land. These guys actually need a runway to get going, and they'll pitter patter their little feet, and they will, get that runway going. They'll be flapping the wings, and finally they'll get airborne. So divers, dabblers, a few behavior clues. Oftentimes, especially in the spring when you're seeing like, ooh, a whole pile of ducks arrive, you'll have dabblers and divers sometimes intermixed in a water body. And you can just watch their behavior and start to say, okay, yeah, no, there's a bunch of divers out with them, but there's also a bunch of dabbling ducks out there. And so that behavior clue can be really, really handy. And here is another picture of that kind of running action, flapping vigorously on the water to try to get airborne. Another thing that's useful, especially in the dabbling ducks, is looking at the wing patterns. The speculum patch on a lot of the dabbling ducks, that's these secondary flight feathers here, it's often brightly colored, and occasionally it's brightly colored in the males and the females. And you can get a sense for what that species is by the wing color. And this is really helpful for the female ducks, the hens, especially as they're flying, or even if they're, loafing around and they give a little wing stretch and they just get a flash of color. Try to make note of what that color and that pattern is. And some of them also have a little forewing patch to boot, making them extra cute, like this little blue-winged teal. Okay, our first dabbling ducks, we have two green-headed ducks. And one of the things that I was reminded of when I was driving to and from Banff was just how easy it is to spot a northern shoveler because of that white side with that kind of rusty patch on it. White really stands out very, very well in all lighting conditions at great distances. So white is something that's really useful to pay attention to. Black can also be useful. It's kind of the opposite of the white, but the white really does shine a great distance. And next time you're driving on the highway, if you're out here on the northern Great Plains, try spotting the northern shovelers, because if you see them on the side, you will see that great big white side and that kind of rusty patch. It is super distinct and stands out even if you're going, 100 and 110 on the highway. You can spot a northern shoveler. You don't even have to look at any of the other characteristics. That's really what's going to help you out there. Of course, northern shovelers do have that lovely spatulate bill. It looks like a shoehorn stuck to a duck's face. It's ridiculous if you get a good look at it. The mallard, on the other hand, doesn't have quite as much white, but it does have that gorgeous green head, has a nice bright yellow bill, and the rear end has a little bit of white on just the tail feathers and those little curls on the drake. So only the boys have those lovely curls. Otherwise, kind of gray body and a chestnut breast. Now, a lot of female ducks make a lot of generic kind of quacking noises, and mallards too make kind of a generic quack. So it's not the most helpful, especially as a beginner, to try to focus on some of those female quacks or some of the other quacks of the ducks. But there are a few that have really nice, distinct calls and that are quite chatty. The northern shoveler is one of them. It makes kind of like a suk suk, suk suk, suk suk call, and it really does this a lot, oftentimes as it's flying by. So usually if it's coming from behind, you're hearing it first and then you're seeing the northern shoveler fly it. So let's listen to the suk suk. So it's a really, really distinct sound, that suk suk, suk suk. Really distinct. Okay. Our two green-headed, larger dabbling ducks in flight. The mallard is going to have a very lovely speculum patch. The center of it is kind of blue, a little bit iridescent, bordered with black and white, both above and below the patch. So blue, and then black, then white in both directions. The northern shoveler has a nice powdery blue forewing patch, white border, and a greenish iridescent speculum patch that kind of fades to dark as you go towards the wingtip. And again, there is that iridescence there, and much like the heads, the green iridescence really depends on having the correct lighting conditions and you being in the right spot to get that reflection. So it can look black, and you can get the odd mallard that tends to tends toward the more blue looking, but you can also see some that just you're in the wrong lighting conditions and their head looks entirely black. So don't be alarmed if you're wondering, my goodness, why does this mallard have a black head? It's just the lighting conditions. Okay, those are the larger green-headed dabbling ducks. Two other dabbling ducks, which I find are very subdued and very handsome. We've got the gadwall on the left here. This duck, the drake overall, is very gray at a distance. When you see it up close, there's all those kind of fine patternings to the plumage, but at a distance, it looks kind of a gray brown. And the thing to pay attention here is the really quite large black patch on the rump. It's oversized, it's exaggerated, it's both above and below. They don't have really anything exciting going on with the tail feathers. They're paler than the rest of it, but that dark rear end really stands out at a distance for the opposite reason that the white stands out, because it's not reflecting any light, and so true black, does appear quite dark. So brownish duck at a distance with a black bum, you know for sure that you've got a gadwall. The bill is kind of orangey black, orange along the sides, and kind of darker blackish down the center. And this is another one that is a very chatty duck. It is my favorite duck sound, and they go bap, 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 bap. If you ever have seen the old 70s Sesame Streets, they had the yip yips. Those are the little aliens to me. It reminds me of the yip yips, and they're just going around going bap, 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 bap. So that's another one that's really useful to learn the call, because they do call a fair bit, especially in flight. So let's listen to the wonderful bepping. I know you can't see me right now, but I have a huge grin on my face because that has to be one of the better duck noises that exists. It's just kind of hilarious. Okay. Next, we have the northern pintail. This is a duck that is very elegant and swan proportioned. And it's one of those that really the body shape, once you learn it, once you get more comfortable with it, it's one of the best identifying features, because it just has such a long, elegant neck to it. A lot of ducks, they can raise their neck, they can lower their neck, but the northern pintail often has its neck up, and it just has just this gorgeous proportion. It's like if a swan was made smaller and in duck form. Of course, the drakes have this lovely long tail, hence the name pintail, but they're really, really quite striking, and that silhouette, that long kind of swan-like neck, really elegant proportions, super useful. Of course, they have that white neck and this white spur that goes up the side of the neck. I know it doesn't seem like much, but that's another thing, because it's white, really, really stands out at a distance. So you'll see that bright white first, and then you'll see the elegant proportions, and you go, aha, that's a northern pintail. The bill is quite smart looking too. It's kind of a mixture of blue and black, nice little kind of sidewalls down the side that are this gorgeous blue color, but really, really gorgeous duck. It's one that calls, but it doesn't call terribly frequently. So really focus on learning the visual aspect of the northern pintail. I think I have them in, yes, I do have them in flight. Perfect. I don't have my little preview this time of what slide is next. So in flight, the gadwall actually has a really striking speculum, again, because of that high contrast. There's that bright white, but it's also bordered with black and a little bit of dark chestnut that often looks quite blackish too, depending on your lighting conditions. But it almost looks like a little white square patch on the wing. And that is really, really useful for identifying them in flight if they're not already going bep, bep, bep at you. Those speculums are super, super helpful. In flight, the northern pintail really looks like a lawn dart. If you have ever seen those old lawn darts that they banned because kids were getting poked with them, they have that same sort of shape. They have, quite a long neck, kind of a bulge at the head, a big body, and then tapering again to that pointy tail. And you might think I'm crazy going like this. a flight silhouette of a duck. Come on, Leanne, they all look the same. I'm telling you, the northern pintail just really has that neck, that elongated neck really stands out when they're flying, and that long tail, if you've got any drakes in the mix, really stands out. If you're just looking at the wing here, the speculum patch right in the center of it, kind of this iridescent green with a bit of copper mixed into it. There's white on the bottom border, and the top border is usually kind of a beigey, buffy color. And buffy is another one of those colors that's kind of obscure, but birders use a lot, and that just kind of describes that kind of straw beigey color. We call it buffy. Okay, so that's the northern pintail and the gadwall in flight. Both of them distinct, but for their own reasons. That little square speculum patch, really, really contrasting with the dark on the gadwall. You can really, it just stands out beautifully. And then the northern pintail, long proportions, long neck and long tail on drakes. Okay, next up, we've got some smaller dabbling ducks. The blue-winged teal and the green-winged teal are both quite small. They're the smallest dabbling ducks. And the American widgeon is a little bit bigger. It's not a huge duck. It's definitely kind of in the medium range. So if you've got a mallard floating around, the American widgeon is going to look smaller than that, and the green-winged teal are just going to look tiny. They're quite dainty little birds. And they all have nice, handy white markings on them. So let's just go through the white markings. So the blue-winged teal, you're going to have that nice crescent shape on the face between the eye and the bill. It's really a large crescent. It takes up a big portion of the face, and it stands out quite a bit at a distance because of that. On the green-winged teal, they've got this nice white spur on the side of the body, just kind of on a canvas of gray. Otherwise, that white little spur, you'd be surprised at how well that stands out at a distance. And the American widgeon, formerly called the bald pate, and that was because that bald is referring to the white on the head. So that nice white patch on the head. This can be variable in males. Some of the drakes, some of them have quite a bit of that dramatic eyeshadow. Some of them have less. Some of them have a bit of a buffy colored patch on the forehead. It does vary a little bit. The thing that really stands out on the widgeon, however, is actually the pink on the sides. There isn't really anything that has that kind of pale, salmony, dusty rose kind of pink on the sides. And to me, whenever I see them, that is the first thing that draws me to them. It's kind of eye-catching because it's just so different than what you're looking at in most of the ducks. It's not gray, it's not brown, it's not white or black. You're like, wow, that is an awful lot of, yeah, like a dusty pinkish color. Now, both the blue-winged teal and the American widgeon have kind of a bicolored rump, so the black on the far end of it and white kind of closer to the rest of the body. The same thing for the American widgeon. The green-winged teal, it's kind of hard to see in this photo, but it's a bit of a triangle of kind of whitish and buffy colors, kind of edged in black. Both the green-winged teal and the American widgeon can show that kind of dramatic eyeshadow stripe, but again, slightly variable in the widgeon. And the green-winged teal, it's not very contrasting. That kind of subtle greenish iridescent color and that kind of dark rusty chestnut. If you have like poor lighting conditions, those two colors, they're really similar in value, so they tend to just look the same. You just wind up getting a dark head overall. Maybe you get a bit of the contrast because there is a little bit of contrast between the two. But the thing that really stands out, little small duck, that little white spur on the side, and then that kind of triangle white on the rear end. Blue-winged teal and green-winged teal, they both have quite nice dark little bills. The widgeon has kind of it stands out as not multicolored, but like two-toned bill, kind of like really pale gray blue on the center and tipped on the front and back and edged in black. So quite the handsome little guys. Let's take a look at them in flight. They all show some variation of green. The blue-winged teal really conveniently shows that lovely blue kind of forewing patch, very, very similar to what the the northern shoveler looked like, but the rest of the bird is quite different. So green speculum patch with that kind of powdery blue forewing patch and a nice kind of wedge of white there in flight. The green-winged teal has a lovely green speculum that's kind of half green and half black. Again, iridescent, so sometimes that shine doesn't show up. And the edges of it are bordered in that kind of buffy tone, so kind of a straw colored above and below. And here you get a nice view of that kind of wedge at the back of the tail, kind of, it's not quite white, it's like cream almost. And the American widgeon has a nice kind of whitish forewing patch and a green and black speculum. Very handsome little ducks. Okay, now we're going to move on to the hens, and I'm just throwing this up here because on the top we have the dabbling hens, and on the bottom we have the diving hens. And something that stands out is the patterning in the plumage. In the dabbling hens, it is really variegated. You know, there's a lot of complex little patternings going on. Their camouflage is really, really great for, you know, upland nesting. So these guys, they nest in kind of the upland habitats, kind of grassy areas, not quite in the wetlands. So they want to really blend in with the surrounding grasses because they don't want to draw attention to themselves, you know, as they're incubating their eggs. And that shows up in the plumage pattern. So really quite detailed plumage that if you just see it, you can tell that that's going to be a dabbling hen just because of all of those little specks, those little streaks through it. They're quite intricately patterned. The diving hens, on the other hand, on the bottom here, they tend to have much plainer plumage overall. It tends usually to be darker, but overall there isn't quite that same level of detail on each of the feathers, and that's because most of these either nest directly above or really adjacent to water, so they want to blend in, they want to look dark like the water surface, or they're cavity nesters and they're also looking to blend into, you know, whatever cavity they're nesting into. You don't want to have something, you know, white and showy if you're trying to hide in a, you know, in a dark cavity. Okay, let's take a look at the dabbling hens. I'm just going to take a little sip of water here. Give you a chance to digest the kind of dabbling hens with orange bills. So we've got the mallard, the gadwall, and the northern shoveler. On the surface, these are both, again, that kind of brown, mottled, variegated feather patterning, and there's orange on the bill. So let's take a look at what that orange is. In the hens, it can be really, really helpful to pay attention to the bill and if you can see any of the speculum patch. So the bill of the mallard hen is going to be nice and orange, and there's going to be a darker center to it. Now that can either be, you know, more of a blotchy, like a single blotch on the bill, kind of like a saddle on it, or it can be more spotted and not quite as large of a dark patch. So it can be either a saddle or speckles, but otherwise, you know, the bill is quite nice and orange. In the gadwall, the orange is restricted to the sides of the bill. Kind of just looks like, you know, maybe she's got some lipstick on. Otherwise, the rest of the bill is kind of dark on the top. So orange along the edges and dark in the center. And of course, the northern shoveler hen is going to have that gigantic kind of, really does look like a shoehorn on the bill. So it's orange, but in the, you know, on the upper part of the upper mandible, it has kind of olivey tone to it, and it really does look kind of outsized on her face. It looks big, it looks chunky, it doesn't look elegant at all, sadly for her. If you do get to see the speculum patch, sometimes it depends on how the bird is holding their wings, how their feathers are, you know, positioned in that moment. So sometimes you won't be able to see it at all. Sometimes you will be able to, especially if they take a bit of a stretch. So if they're like walking around, you know, especially as they have ducklings and they're resting their ducklings, sometimes the mom will take a nice stretch and you'll get a glimpse of the wing. So the mallard hen is going to have that blue center with the black and white border. So you can see the nice blue to black to white speculum patch just peeking out here. And in the gadwall, going to have that nice little white square, and that's just peeking out right there. And the speculum patch in the northern shoveler is going to be green with a little bit of a white border above. Next, we can take a look at the faces, but they're fairly similar. You know, the mallard hen has this dark eye line that kind of goes through, but overall, they tend to have a paler head than the rest of the body. I wouldn't use that as my only clue, but that can help as, you know, kind of a supporting your identification and your kind of mental checklist of going through it and comparing it to your field guide. So tends to have a bit more of a paler head than the rest of the body. The gadwall too has a bit of a paler head compared to the rest of the body, and there is a faint little eye line there. Same thing with the northern shoveler. There's an even fainter little eye line that goes through the eye, but in general, there's no contrast between the tones of the head and the tones of the body, like you can see in the mallard and the gadwall a little bit here. And compare those two dabbling hens just even closer side by side. So that speculum patch is going to be helpful. And again, that bill pattern. So the mallard hen, orange with kind of a dark center, but it's either a big blotch or it's speckles, kind of a saddle shape. On the gadwall, it's more, imagine a darker bill with kind of orange lipstick going around the side, really kind of restrict that orange to more of the edges. It's not the whole bill that looks kind of orangey. Okay, two other dabbling hens. We've got the northern pintail and the American widgeon. I'll actually start with the American widgeon because I find they're a little bit more easy to identify. And the thing that helps you identify them is they they have a bit of that dark eyeshadow, a bit of a dark smudge right around the eye. It really stands out at a distance because none of the other hens have that. So you see kind of a grayish head in a distance, and just around where the eye is, it just gets darker. She also tends to have a bit warmer brown body colors, and they're a little bit more plain than some of the other hens. That bill is very, very similar to the Drake's, kind of that pale gray blue bordered in black. It's also a stubby little bill. It's not a nice long one or anything. If you do see the speculum, it's black green with a little white top border. Now, the northern pintail hen, she is a study in subtleties. In this particular photograph, it's kind of a useful photograph because she's not showing off her long, elegant neck, and sometimes you don't see all of those features that you would like to see. That tail does tend to be a bit long and pointy compared to the other ducks, but it's not as dramatic as it is in the drake. The thing that really stands out about the northern pintail is that the head is very plain, and it's warmer brown than the rest of the body, and this it's subtle. It's not the easiest thing to do. So oftentimes you're still going to be seeing those similar proportions, a very elegant looking duck, kind of a nice long neck, depending on when you catch the moment. But if you're, for your supporting characteristics, take a look at the head. Very, very plain. There isn't much going on around the eye, and it is a warmer brown than the rest of the body. The rest of the body tends to be a bit more, especially kind of the breast and the flanks, tends toward the kind of cooler brown tones. And nice little dark bill. So definitely a medium-sized duck, going to be bigger than the widgeon for sure. Okay, now let's compare our two small dabbling hens, and those are the blue-winged teal. And it took me a long time to, just wrap my head around telling these two apart. They're small, which means if they're far away, it's harder to see stuff on them. And I struggled for a while until I figured out just a few clues that were really, really helpful. And one of the big ones is, it's a small duck. Both of them have dark bills, but if you take a look at the rear end on the green-winged teal, you will almost always be able to see this little patch here. It can be white or kind of creamy colored. It's just a solid patch of white. You do not have that on the blue-winged teal, and because it is a light pale color, it does still stand out at a distance. So take a look at the rear end and check for that little pale stripe. Moving on to the head area, the blue-winged teal has pale eye arcs and a pale base to the bill, which overall makes the head look, generally speaking, just lighter in color. The green-winged teal lacks that. The green-winged teal doesn't have any paleness at the base of the bill. There's none of those eye arcs. She actually has, a nice dark eye line that goes through the eye. And all that makes for a rather dark looking head. It's actually quite a blocky head compared to the blue-winged teal. Nice rounded head. Green-winged teal is just a bit more blocky looking, but overall looks quite dark versus the blue-winged teal that winds up feeling lighter and paler because of the pale eye arcs around the eye, really highlighting the eye and the base of the bill. So those are the two kind of clues. Look at the rear end and see if you can't see a white patch on it, and then move on to the head. Does it look pale overall? Do you see those little eye arcs of white at the base of the bill? It's not super white, but it is paler. And those green-winged teals hens, they're just going to have a much darker head overall, dark eye line, and you're going to be missing those, pale feathering colors. So both have a greenish speculum, both have dark bills, both are small. And if you just get to teal, you should feel pretty good about yourself because it is tough. And, it took me a long time to try to figure them out on my own. Not going to lie, some of that stuff can be quite challenging. Okay. Moving along, we're going to enter into the world of the diving ducks. And I just want to mention that I remember I added a bunch of divers. We added the mergansers a few sessions ago. I had intended to add them to this, but my injury has kind of taken up a lot more of my time than I had anticipated. So sadly, I won't have the mergansers there for you to review. You can always go back to the recording where we did all the diving ducks at once. Okay, so we're on to our divers. You're seeing ducks out there. These guys tend to be on, deeper water, bodies of water, because they do want to dive. They do want to get down into some of those, underwater habitats. So there's two that have the lovely red head, and the red head I find is one of the least helpful bits because both of them have it and it looks fairly similar. Two things that you really want to pay attention to. First off, the canvas back has an immensely large white body. That white really stands out at a distance. And I want you to remember, you think canvas back, think, beautiful, pristine white canvas. And that white really, really, really does stand out at a distance. The redhead, it does have, black and white plumage on there, but it all blends into a gray color and it doesn't reflect the light. If you see a canvas back on the water, it is almost like they're glowing. They are so white. The redhead doesn't glow. It has kind of a grayish body. So just quickly, you're looking, oh, got orangey heads. What color is the body? Even before you get to redhead, like red on the head, the canvas back really, really stands out. They just glow on the water's surface. The other thing is the shape of the head, and that's best thought about as a little skier. So on the canvas back, that is a nice easy run. Imagine yourself on skis at the top of it. Maybe you're not so terrified. It's an easy run versus the red head is going to have a much steeper forehead. It isn't that kind of gradual, gentle slope. You're imagining you're a little skier. Your skier might be scared if they're not a very good skier. I would be terrified in that scenario. So that gently sloping head, even if you have the worst lighting conditions, the shape of the body is just so unique and, it really does stand out at a distance. But if you're comparing, you're going, gosh, I'm not sure which of them, redhead has that nice steep forehead, that kind of scooped out forehead into the bill, and the canvas back, it's kind of more of a straight line from the top of the head to the tip of the bill. Here you can see them side by side, similar lighting. Again, that canvas back, that bright white really, really, really does shine. It just stands out. And the overall grayness of the back of the redhead, just doesn't reflect the light the same way. And again, that head shape is really useful, very strongly, scooped out, steep in the redhead, and your little skier is pretty confident going down your slope of the canvas back. Okay, next up we have some black and white diving ducks. I also didn't wind up having the time to add in the golden eye, so you'll have that will be one for homework. Look up the golden eye. So otherwise, the black and white diving ducks we covered the two scaup species, both the lesser and greater scaup, and the ringneck duck. So all of these at a quick glance, they kind of look like an Oreo cookie. There's heavy dark on the front, head and breast, and there's heavy dark on the rear end. Kind of sandwiched in between that is some non-black, some paler coloration. So get yourself situated with your kind of Oreo cookie diving duck, and then I want you to look at the color of the back. What color is it? In the ringneck duck, that whole back is going to be jet black, and that really does stand out compared to what winds up looking fairly gray for both the greater and lesser scaup at a distance. All that lovely patterning just blurs to gray at any sort of distance. So gray back, you're dealing with the scaups, and ringneck duck still has that Oreo cookie look to it, but has a nice dark black back. The ringneck duck should be called the ring-billed duck, in my personal opinion, because the ring on the bill is really, really useful for identifying the ringneck duck. Again, it's white. It really stands out at a difference, you know, because the rest of the bill is so dark, that white ring near the tip of it just stands out. Of course, so does the little edge on the bill, but really that ring is gonna draw your eye to it. And again, that black back. The flanks are a much darker gray. Depending on the light, that can wash out and look kind of palish and whitish, but they do also have a little bit of a white spur along the side of their flanks. Now, the lesser scaup and greater scaup, those two species are they're tough to tell apart. There's iridescence on the head, but there is overlap in that iridescence, and it's not always reliable. What you're going to be looking for mostly is the shape of the head. And on the lesser scaup, which is the one that you're going to see breeding, on the northern Great Plains, you're going to have the peak of the head kind of pushed farther back. So you can see that little peak to the head back here. It's not forward on the head like it is on the greater scaup. They really kind of look like they've got a bulbous, imagine an alien head sticking out. And this can vary subtly by how the bird is holding itself. So don't worry if, you're just getting to scaup on migration. You're likely to see both in a lot of places. So feel pretty good about getting to scaup and then, start working on those subtleties of shape as you get more and more, confident with telling your scaup apart. They're actually way easier to identify in flight. So in flight, they do look similar, but the extent of the white on the wing, so that kind of on the secondaries where the speculum patch would be on the divers, those secondaries are white in the greater scaup, and that continues in through to the wing tip. It doesn't extend all the way, but the white extends into the primary feathers, making it look like there's quite a nice, long strip of white. In flight, the lesser scaup, you can see the wing has white restricted to the secondary feathers, and it doesn't kind of bleed into the wing tip. It doesn't go into the primary feathers. So it's actually much easier if they happen to be flying by you to tell the two apart. So maybe you can stick to that for the first little while. The lesser scaup has a lesser amount of white, and the greater scaup has a greater amount of white. So hopefully you can remember that little trick, and the next time you have some scaup flying past you, whizzing by, maybe you can get a little bit of practice, or just watching them as they're out on a water body, and occasionally they'll get up and fly away. Okay, we have a couple of small diving ducks too, and the bufflehead often tends to be out in larger bodies of water. Ruddy ducks really like wetlands, and that's not to say in migration that they can't both be found in the same places, but during the breeding season, you'll often find ruddy ducks. They really like these dense cattail wetlands that have lots of emergent vegetation, and they don't necessarily need to be super, super deep to have ruddy ducks on them. Ruddy ducks are super unique in terms of coloration and shape. I hope that everyone at some point in their life gets to see a ruddy duck in full breeding plumage, because a photo does not do that bill justice. It is electric sky blue, if that makes sense. It is just so incredibly blue. So that alone, helps you identify it. Other things, you might not be seeing it in great conditions. Sometimes that blue just doesn't shine because the lighting kind of sucks for it. But the drakes, they will often have their tail stuck up, and they have quite a long tail. They belong to the stiff tail duck family. They're quite a compact little duck too. That white cheek patch really, really does stand out at a distance. So even if they're far away and the lighting's terrible, you can use the duck's shape as well as that bright white cheek patch to tell them apart. But hopefully someday you get to see them in person in full breeding plumage up close. They're just so handsome. The bufflehead is another one that really stands out at a distance because it has a very large white patch on the back of an otherwise black and iridescent head. Really, really, really stands out at a distance, just that white patch on the back of the head. And the body's kind of unique too. The top is jet black, whereas a large chunk of the bottom of the body is quite bright white. And they have just a teeny tiny stubby little bill. And they're super, super active. It is really tough to tell how many bufflehead you might have if there's more than like 3 or 4 at a time, because they dive frequently and they can stay under for a good amount of time. So it's always tough to get a decent count of buffleheads if you're seeing them, just because they are so active. And it's going to be one of those things like you point it out to someone, and then as soon as you point it out to them, they're going to dive. I can almost guarantee it. So bufflehead and reddy duck, two rather small diving ducks, but both of them are fairly unique. Okay, now we're going to venture into the diving duck hens. Just again, want to show that difference in the overall pattern of the plumage overall of the different hens. So let's take a look. First off, we'll just treat the canvasback on her own. She's pretty plain, except that head shape really, really does, stand out at a large distance. And remember, we're going to have our little green run skier feeling pretty confident about going down that nice, gentle slope. That bill is nice and dark. Otherwise, warm brown, the head quite warm brown, a little bit of a pale throat going on, but really the head shape is just so distinct that that's what you're going to be drawn to. So it is a large bird. They have quite large bodies, but they get that nice, lovely, gentle slope. But we also have a bunch of other large brown diving ducks where the hens they're starting to look a little bit similar. So first we'll look at the ringneck duck. And again, just remember the ringneck, actually the ring is visible on the bill. So that nice white ring around the tip of the bill is super useful for telling the hens. That's one of the most kind of distinct features. They do have a little bit of, a pale eye ring going on. The base of the bill is a little pale, and they tend to be warm brown, with the back being darker than the rest of, say, like the flanks and the breast. Moving along, we've got the redhead. She's arguably the most plain of the larger diving hens. So they all have a steep forehead. She's kind of warmish brown. There is a little bit of a pale eye ring, a little bit of a pale eye shadow going on, and pale base of the bill. The female redheads are one of the trickier ones to tell apart. But again, their back tends to be a little bit darker and distinct from the rest of the flanks. And if you're wondering to tell it apart from the ringneck duck, there is no ring on the bill of the redhead. The bill is just kind of dark grayish overall. The scaup, on the other hand, and we'll be looking at the lesser scaup here as our scaup representative, she's going to have a paler eye, which that can stand out a little bit at a distance. And oftentimes there's a fair amount of white at the base of the bill, but this can vary a fair bit depending on where she's at in her molt cycle. And some just seem to have a little bit, less distinct white at the base of the bill than the others. You can see in this little inset photo here. just a little bit less white. It is quite variable, and the eye can be kind of yellow or brown, and I find it just kind of makes them look a little bit haggard and distressed, like a mom that's been dealing with a pack of toddlers all day. They just that paler eye just kind of lends a bit of a kind of a craziness to their eye. So those are your larger brown diving hens, and yep, they are a little bit tougher to tell apart than the small little the small dabbling hens. Okay, the small diving hens, we've got the ruddy duck hen. She doesn't always keep that tail quite stuck up in the air like the drakes do, but oftentimes you'll see it raised. It does have a compact shape, biggish bill for the rest of the head, and there's a pale cheek patch that has kind of a, those lines that a football player would streak underneath their eye. You can sort of see that on the ruddy duck here. But again, you know, kind of a distinct shape overall. It's a very compact little duck, warm brown overall, kind of harkening back to the drakes, a cinnamony, rusty color. And again, that bill looks quite large for the size of the duck. The bufflehead hen is quite dark overall, and it's not a warm kind of brown or dark. It's a very kind of cool slate tone, so quite dark overall. There's a white patch below and behind the eye, that head shape with that kind of small, little stubby bill, nice and dark, but kind of stubby and small. They're just kind of little dark, unassuming little birds. You can see a little bit of a white wing patch oftentimes. And again, this is going to be a small little dark duck that is quite active, going to be diving repeatedly and, swimming around, being quite active. So that really, really dark, kind of cool, dark looking overall with that white patch kind of below and behind the eye and a little stubby bill. Okay, moving along now away from the ducks finally, we're going to take a look at the grebes. And grebes overall, they are divers. They're going to be diving underwater in search of primarily fish. They have their legs much farther back on their bodies than, say, the diving ducks do, which makes them even more awkward on land. So, they're really only going to be waddling up onto their nests, which are oftentimes either built up from, the wetland bottom or made into, the wetland vegetation. But essentially, they're mostly going to be pushing themselves up onto their nest because their legs are quite far back. Excuse me. Both sexes look the same, and some of them can be quite vocal, like the redneck grebe and the pie-billed grebe. You are in some ways more likely to hear them, but you still have good chances of seeing them overall. So the redneck grebe, the thing that really stands out is that silvery cheek patch. The rest of the kind of reddish gray black tones, those can really just meld together, especially at a distance. But that really big white cheek patch stands out, as well as the overall shape. That's quite a large pointy bill, and they kind of, like, in shape, it's more reminiscent of a loon than it is, say, some of the other grebes. So that nice kind of long bill, and just a very sleek looking bird. Looks like it really belongs on the water. If you see them up close, you can see that nice red neck, but mostly you want to be paying attention to that cheek patch. And they do a loud kind of whinnying, braying call, and you can hear this call at a great distance, especially, if there's a few of them on a lake. Sound travels really well over, water's surface. So if it's a large body of water that has emergent vegetation along a lot of the sides, you can get several redneck grebe pairs, and you can hear this, especially kind of evening time. Let's have a listen to the whinnying, braying call of the redneck grebe. So quite kind of, it really does sound like a maybe a donkey braying at quite a distance. Okay, Next, we have the pied-bill grebe. Overall, this is a much smaller grebe, very compact looking. It doesn't have a long bill. That bill really does stand out because it's whitish with that dark ring around the tip, hence the name pied-billed, meaning two-colored. So that that whitish on the bill also extends around the eye. There's a little bit of flesh there that's white colored, so you can really it really does stand out on an otherwise very dark looking grebe. Grebes don't really have much in the way of tail feathers. They tend to have fluffy looking bums. So that can be another tell if you're, looking at a grebe or a duck. Just take a look at the rear end, and if it looks like a fuzzy little mess or you can't really see much of a tail, it could very well be a grebe. They do have a nice dark throat, but otherwise very plain, very brown, and it's that bill that really, really stands out because of that, bright whitish coloration and that kind of ring around the eye. They do vocalize a fair bit, and they can be very sneaky. They don't like to be seen, and they'll often do, a little submarine game where they'll slowly sink below the water surface, or they'll slowly come back up and see if you're still looking at them. There's two main calls that they do. The first is the owl hoop, and this too, even though they tend to pick smaller wetlands, because it's very, very loud, it can be heard over, a fair distance. So let's listen to the owl hoop call. And they'll often draw it out like that. They don't always draw it out, but oftentimes it's just kind of drawn out, and they get, it sounds like they're getting tired as they're going. The hyena is a much quieter call, and you'll often have this done as a kind of duet between members of a pair. So you might hear this if, you happen to be closer to where they're at in the wetland. Here's the hyena call, and it does sound sort of like laughing in the wetland. And that is the hyena call. Two other grebes that you're likely to encounter are the horned grebe and the eared grebe. These guys are vocal mainly in the early part of the season. Um, they don't tend to call a whole lot later on in the season, so we're going to focus mainly on the visuals for these two. Now, superficially, they look quite similar. There's that kind of rusty color and dark coloration, dark back, rusty flanks. They do look similar, but the horned grebe, the white behind the eye is much more solid. In the eared grebe, it looks like wispy little plumes. On the horned grebe, it really does look like a substantial eyebrow. And overall, the head tends to be a bit more flat, or you can think of it as the peak is really far behind in the head. I tend to think of it as overall more of a flat topped head versus the eared grebe. It winds up really, really looking, especially at a distance, like they just have a little triangular head. Beautiful little equilateral triangle, both sides the same, really have that peak right up in the center of it. Sometimes those wispy plumes, because they're diving a lot, they can get kind of stuck together a little bit, but the head shape is really, really going to help you identify these two species, as well as some habits of their, where they like to nest and who they like to hang out with. So horned grebes are usually just found in pairs on a little breeding pond, and those breeding ponds can be quite small. Eared grebes, on the other hand, they're a colonial species, meaning that they like to nest with friends. So you'll see, if you won't often just see one or two eared grebes, you're going to see a dozen, 50, 200 eared grebes. You can really, if you're seeing lots of them and you're into the breeding season, of course, migration, you can throw some of those rules at the books, but on, really during the heart of the breeding season, June onwards, you're going to be finding eared grebes hanging out with other eared grebes in some sort of a nesting colony. Horned grebes, again, you'll see them in pairs on small ponds. So that can be a helpful little behavior clue. The other two grebes that we covered, we've got very similar species, the western grebe and the Clark's grebe. Overall, they're very, very long-necked and long-billed. They're black and white overall. Western grebe is by far the most numerous one. So this is the one that you are likely to see. And that eye is surrounded by dark feathering. So that dark feathering encompasses the eye, and the bill is more just of a dull yellowish color. The Clark's grebe, on the other hand, you can see the eye. So that eye is not surrounded by dark feathers, it is surrounded by the light feathers. And the bill is quite bright yellows, like almost orangey tones to it. And as someone brought up in the last webinar as well, or when we covered them, there is a slight upturn to it, but I wouldn't rely on that necessarily as a feature. They do have it, but the thing that's going to be striking is, holy smokes, like that is like a banana on the end of that grebe's face, because it is such a rich, bright yellow compared to the Western grebes. And if you're seeing Clark's grebe, you are for sure seeing Western grebe. So they do wind up standing out because of that. So again, Western grebe, that dark surrounds the eye, and the Clark's grebe, um, the the dark doesn't dip down and conceal the eye. You can see the eye because there's the white feathering around it. That's just kind of how I try to remember them. They both make creaking noises, but this is usually a species that you're going to spot just because they're so big, and that black and white patterning really stands out at a distance. Okie dokie, on to the rails. Let's do the coot first because it's kind of the outlier in terms of rails that you're going to see on the northern Great Plains. So the American coot acts much like a duck. You're going to be seeing the coot floating around on the water's surface out in the open, paddling around and picking at stuff on the water's surface. It is jet black with this really lovely bright white bill that's kind of just tipped at the very, very tip, circled in a little bit of a darker color. And I think it usually tends a bit towards the reddish, but you usually can't make that out. And they do have this little forehead shield, and I'm not sure why they have that forehead shield. They just do. It's probably one of those things that says, hey, baby, look at my lovely forehead shield. And maybe that drives the ladies crazy. We don't know. Anyway, so the American coot is a rail that is going to be acting like a duck. You'll see them out, out and about on the pond surface, on the wetland surface, and they also have little white feathering on their tail, and they get into spats oftentimes with their neighbors. And part of signaling to one another, you'll see them do all kinds of postures and fighting, but they'll fan their tails out and they'll flash their white tail feathers at each other. And I kind of think of that as waving the white flag there. It's like, okay, we're good, we're good. So otherwise really, really jet black, and that does stand out, especially because that jet black and that white bill just makes them obvious. And they make a lot of kind of chicken-like noises, lots of popping, lots of hiccuping noises, lots of burring noises. So let's have a listen to the American coot. So they really just make all kinds of little noises, and it's more something that's going to draw your attention because you hear a little bit going on. Now let's go to the other rails, which are, as a general rule, a lot more secretive. So these are really birds that you are going to hear way more often than you're going to see them. You can get lucky and get great looks at them, but more often than not, you're just going to be hearing these species. So let's start with just the calls first. So the Sora is incredibly vocal. They will call throughout the day, and they're kind of territorial, and they will go off at kind of any loud noise. So if you happen to, especially here on the prairies, as you're driving around a grid road, you get out to look at a wetland and you happen to like slam your car door, that can be enough to get the Soras in that wetland calling and going. So when I say they're quite vocal and territorial, I really do mean it. So one of the more frequent calls that you're going to hear is probably the per weep, and it's just a short little call that rises per weep, and they'll do this a fair bit. So that nice kind of high pitch purr weep, and that carries quite a distance, as does the whinny. So I'll just play it and I won't try to imitate it for you. And that's another one, kind of like the pied-billed grebe, that end part of the whinny, sometimes it ends, quite quickly and it's abrupt. And I've had some of them go on for like 10 seconds or more, where they just kind of keep going with that the rest of the whinny call. So let's play the whinny one more time for you, because this really is one that you're likely to hear. Otherwise, bright yellow bill, black little mask, kind of a bluish gray, side of the face and going down the side of the flanks, and kind of brown and streaky otherwise. And that white tail, that kind of underside of the tail, can really be helpful if you're just seeing something white flash through the cattails or through the reed beds or whatever. But they really don't make themselves seen a whole lot. They can be sometimes really, really close to you and calling like mad, and sometimes you'll just never see them because they're not coming out of the wetland to come investigate you. They don't fly great. They really want to, employ the kind of sneakiness. So quite a handsome little bird. The next two rails, if you thought the Sora was sneaky, are extra sneaky. The yellow rail, seldom seen, almost solely heard by folks. The Virginia rail, you can get lucky the odd time, but they tend to be fewer on the landscape than the Sora, and they're also a sneaky little bird. They don't like to be seen a whole lot. If you do get to see them, that kind of long, droopy red bill stands out a fair bit, and that kind of pale grayish face on an otherwise rather dark, warm brown body. The Virginia rail is really quite active, kind of sunset and sunrise. Their calling rate drops off a fair bit after sunrise, but they will also call at night. So if you ever have the chance to go, check out a wetland at night, I recommend it, because you're more likely to hear a Virginia rail if they happen to be in that wetland. They do two calls. The first is the ticket, and sometimes the ticket can be going, and it's easy to kind of not hear it and tune out. Let's listen to the ticket here. And that too can sometimes go on for a long time, or it can be a shorter series of ticket like that call was. But sometimes, they really do go on for 10, 15 seconds, just going ticket, 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 ticket. I'll play it once more here. Another call that they do is the grunt call, and this is one that they'll also do as a duet. Kind of sounds like a little piglet in the marsh. I'll play that once more. The yellow rail, as I mentioned, seldom seen. They like shallow, grassy, sedgy wetlands with lots of snails. So if you're ever trying to find them, that's the kind of habitat that you want to be seeking out. And they are, especially, in the south where we do get nighttime, they're very nocturnal. So much so that even on, if there's a night with a full moon, you're less likely to hear them, because they really do like to be very, very sneaky. They don't fly super well. Their call sounds like tapping two stones together in a rhythmic tick 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 pattern. And that can go on for some time. If you have multiple, it starts to sound like popcorn. Okay, We've got a couple of bittern species. These are two other species that are much, much more likely to be heard than seen. The American bittern does the pumperlunk call, which travels a great distance and often called on the prairies the slough pumper because it sounds like it's some sort of pumping mechanism in a wetland, and slough is a colloquial term for wetlands out here. So let's listen to the pumperlunk call. So really kind of liquidy, bassy sound. And again, this is something that you can hear a great distance away. Lower frequency sounds, they get through vegetation and stuff better, and so those sound waves actually travel farther. Let's listen to it once more. The American bittern pumperlunk. The least bittern is a tiny little bittern. They're related to the herons, but the least bittern is quite small. They do kind of a gentle cuckoo cooing noise in the wetland, and they're quite secretive. They clamber around the vegetation, so you are hard pressed to see them, even if you're out there looking for them every day. So they do this gentle cuckoo cuckoo coo call. And unlike the American bittern, that isn't a call that is particularly loud, that travels very far. So you'll wind up, you know, if you are hearing a least bittern, chances are you're a fair bit closer to it than the American bittern. Let's play the coo 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 one more time. Okay, next up, we've got the great blue heron. This is a large heron with a kind of great big all-purpose stabby bill. They'll go after pretty much anything that they can swallow is fair game for them. They're quite large overall, blue-gray, and they have a kind of nice dark eyebrow that runs down back behind the head. This is a, really handsome species, and they travel a great distance away from nesting colonies to go forage. So even if you're seeing them, around your favorite slough, they could be nesting like 20 kilometers away and, be thinking nothing of it because they're just heading out to their hunting grounds. So great blue herons are really handsome, and they're pretty obvious. Usually they're, waiting in a wetland, and they keep rather still. They're a bit more of a, an ambush predator, so they'll kind of gently wait around or stand still and spear anything that they can find. The white-faced ibis is a funny looking bird, especially when you compare it to the great blue heron. They have a long, drooping bill. Their body is kind of this maroon brown, and they have these beautiful iridescent feathers on their backs and their wings. They have kind of reddish legs, and they're a strange little bird. They're increasing on the Canadian prairies. You know, they kind of showed up in Alberta first, and we're seeing more and more of them in Saskatchewan here, and I'm sure you're seeing a few of them in Manitoba as well. The white-faced ibis, they're quite distinct. That dark maroon color and that overall shape, kind of long legs and just a really large drooping bill is pretty unique. So they're a handsome little bird, and you'll often see them in larger groups. I think the largest one I've seen in Saskatchewan was something around 80 or 90 birds all together. So I was pretty excited when I found those. Okay, moving on to our shorebirds. The Wilson snipe is a shorebird that you are more likely to hear than you are to see. They hang out not kind of on the wetland margins, but they hang out in kind of shallow, moist soil edges of the wetlands, and they're well camouflaged. So they're something that you might see if you happen to see one perching up, or if you're lucky enough to see one do their flight display. So the Wilson snipe has two vocalizations. And the first one is this winnowing flight display, and that's one that's made with the tail feathers. So it's not actually they're not vocalizing. It's a sound made through the wind moving over their tail feathers as they fly up and they stoop down at high speeds. Think like as a peregrine falcon stoops, but it's a snipe, it's not that fast, and it's making this kind of winnowing noise. So let's listen to the winnowing flight display. And this is something that if you're out, especially if you're like close to the wetland, it sounds like it's happening like all around you because the bird is in active flight. They are displaying all around. So it can be hard to count them if you have several. So it's a really kind of haunting sound, and it's really neat when you get to hear that. And they're quite vocal in the evening time, especially. Another call that they do that you're also likely to hear, it sounds like a squeaky wheel. They do kind of a keck, keck, keck call. I just think of a kid riding, maybe like a tricycle that needs its wheels oiled. And next up, we have the killdeer. This is one that you're both likely to see and hear. Their species epithet is vociferous, and they live up to that name. They are quite vocal. If you've ever had the experience to be near a killdeer, you know that it's quite loud. And they're one of those birds that says their name, so they actually have a killdeer call. Killdeer, killdeer, killdeer. Let's play that first. And they can be quite uppity. So if you are near them and where they have their nest or their chicks, they will surely let you know about it. They're famous for doing, a broken wing display and trying to lead predators away from their nest or their chicks. Visually, they're quite a handsome little bird. They have two dark rings around their neck. And I like to imagine if you were to look at it like straight on, it would almost look like a little bullseye. So you can kill deer and think bullseye, and it all kind of relates that way. So otherwise they have kind of a small pigeon-like head, and you are likely to see these guys, on the edges of wetlands that have exposed shorelines, but also in a lot of other places that have, exposed ground near some water. So they're notorious for laying their eggs in gravel parking lots. You will also see them on the margins of tilled up fields near kind of wetlandy areas. So you can, see and hear killdeer in a lot of different scenarios. A few other shorebirds, again, more of the ones that you are likely to identify visually than by ear. Wilson's phalarope, very striking. They have a very, very fine needle-like bill. And when they're out feeding, they're going to be hanging out in a water body, and they'll be swimming in kind of fast little circles with their little feet churning up little bits of stuff to eat. They have a lovely, nice dark eyeline. This is a species that the sex roles are reversed. So the females are the boldly colored, bright ones, the ones that are aggressive and going to be defending territory. And the males are the ones that are actually responsible for, taking care of the chicks, and they don't do much of that nest defense. So they have a nice orange wash on the throat, and that super, super fine needle-like bill should make you think phalarope. And then Wilson's phalarope is the one that we have nesting here during the breeding season, but you can see other phalaropes on migration. American avocets, they're just so handsome. This is a bold, kind of black and white bird that has a salmon wash across the head and neck, and has a very, very long, dark, fine, slightly upturned bill. I was really excited. I got to see my first of the season one as we were driving home from Banff on Saturday, and I just love seeing them because their bodies are just kind of a big, bulky body, but really fine little legs that are kind of pale blue, and this lovely, salmony wash to the neck. They're just a handsome little bird. When they, open up their wings, that bold black and white ring pattern is just gorgeous as well. So the American avocets are one that, you're really, going to be identifying by sight, and they're quite distinct, as is the black-necked stilt. This is another bold black and white colored bird, very similar to the Wilson's phalarope, has a very fine, pointy, needle-like little bill, but they're standing atop these impossibly long, fine, bubblegum pink legs. It doesn't look like they should be able to get around on those. It just seems risky to me. But otherwise, that bold black and white coloration, really, really fine, pointy bill. They're just such a handsome little bird. And this is another one that is, slowly increasing, especially here in Saskatchewan, coming in from Alberta, moving a little bit farther eastwards, as we march on in years over time. So black-necked stilts are super, super handsome. I do love seeing them. Couple of other shorebirds. Whew, I'm gonna have to start talking faster. We've got the willet and the marbled godwit. The willet overall is kind of a cool gray-toned bird, decently long bill that's kind of plainish gray overall, and the legs are quite plain. The thing that stands out is if you get to see them in flight or stretching out their wings, they have bold black and white wing patterns. And both the willet and the godwit, they're both very, very vocal, much like the killdeer. If you are in their territory, they will let you know it. So willet is another namesayer, and some of the calls are more of a willet willet, and some of them kind of fall more in that pill will willet, but there's lots of variations on these. Let's play a couple of examples. Oh no, why didn't that play? There we go. And the willet. Oh, hey, why are we? There we go. Oh. Let's play that once more. Oh my goodness. Marble godwit, on the other hand, as opposed to the willet that has these kind of cool brown gray tones, the marbled godwit is more, warm brown tones, especially on the wings. When you see them outstretched, they are kind of warm cinnamony colored. They're quite distinct, lovely, especially in comparison to the willet, that black and white striking. The godwit has really just warm cinnamon brown wings. Has a long upturned bill that's two-toned, so it's kind of orange at the base, and it fades to dark at the tip. And marbled godwits are another namesayer and another one that is going to vocalize if you're anywhere near its territory. The willet may be a little bit nicer to listen to. The godwit sounds a little bit more desperate about it. But both large-ish shorebirds that you're likely to encounter here on the Northern Great Plains. And as a bonus, I've got two yellow leg species because while they don't nest in the area that we're covering, they tend to migrate quite late, some of them, and any of the failed breeders are, turn around and are back 2 weeks later. So they're around for a lot of the breeding season in, say, southern Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Manitoba, even if they're not necessarily breeding there. Both of them look very similar, and they can be tough to tell apart, as you're probably trying to figure out right now. But the both of them, they're, quite spotted, quite gray above, white below, and they have bright yellow legs, hence the name yellow legs. So we have the lesser yellow legs and the greater yellow legs. Now, there is a size difference, and that can be handy if the two are side by side, or you have, say, another shorebird that you're more familiar with the size of, but it's not something that, like, it's easy to tell, like, oh, that is for sure a lesser. It's out there on a shoreline on its own. It's really tough to tell exactly how big or how small something is when it's on its own. The key here, we're going to be looking at the bill length compared to the rest of the head length. So the lesser has a shorter, finer bill, and it's about the same length as the rest of its head. The greater yellow legs, that bill is greater than the length of the head. And I think yeah, we go. Okay. So imagine here you're measuring the length of the head, and this is something you can do because it's you're comparing a body part to something that's already on the bird. So this kind of comparison is super handy to do. And imagine if you're moving that bar down, does it, oh, yes, it does. It is about the same length as the length of the head. We're pretty good, feeling pretty good about lesser yellow legs versus the greater yellow legs. You imagine moving that invisible bar down along the bill, and it's, oh, the bill is a little bit longer. Don't worry, if you're a new birder, even if you're a pretty good birder, it is really tough to tell these two species apart. You can't always do it if you don't have a, a good enough look at them. So, you know, you're doing pretty good if you're getting them down to yellow legs. So don't feel bad. And it's even the subject of jokes. There's an old guide to the little known and seldom seen birds of North America, which is a joke book. But I thought this part of it was like hilarious because there is a lot of overlap in terms of size, and bill length varies. So take it with a grain of salt. This is just a funny gag, but um, it's confusing, and it's well known for being confusing. So if you're finding yourself having a hard time distinguishing between the yellow legs, rest assured that everyone else is having a hard time too. So just mostly just try to laugh at it because birding can be tough, and some things are tougher than others. Okay, we've got a couple of terns. First, we've got the black tern, which has got a nice jet black body and very pale silvery wings. It picks the insects off the water and has a very kind of buoyant flight. These are ones that can forage like so far away from their nesting colonies. I want to say upwards of 80 kilometers is not uncommon for them. So, you know, they're they can sometimes be there all of a sudden and then gone just as suddenly as they arrived. So interesting little foraging pattern, but very distinct looking bird. The common and forester's terns, very similar, and that's another one like the yellow legs that it's tough. Don't feel bad if you can get to narrowing it down to the two. You're still doing a great job. They look very similar. They've got that, black cap and a white and gray body, and both of them dive into water after prey. So they'll plunge head first, and they'll dive in, not a deep dive, but they're going in after small little bait fish. So similar behaviors between the two, but quite different than the behavior of the black tern. Telling the terns apart is actually easiest if you see the birds perched. So the wing tips on the common tern, when the wing is folded, you can see these are the primary feathers here. Those make up the wing tip. In the common tern, as those are folded, they're just dark gray enough that they come together, and they tend to look quite dark overall compared to the rest of the feathering on the bird's wing and the bird's back. So those folded wings, look for that wingtip and just see if it's a nice dark coloration. On the forester's tern, that folded wingtip, they look more kind of silvery gray. It's not quite dark and contrasting with the rest of, the feathering on the wings. So that's one clue. And the other, if you can get to see it, if you have, the right kind of angles on the bird, the tail length compared to the wingtip length. So in the common tern, though, you can find the wingtips, and the tail is actually shorter than the wingtip. So you'll find the tail tucked under below there. So looking out to the wingtips and then try to find the tail. Tail is shorter on the common tern. On the forester's tern, here's the wingtips here, and that tail hanging down quite long. So the tail is longer. As a secondary characteristic, there is a bit of difference in the bill color, but that is really tough to tell. More red on the common, more orange on the forester's tern, but between red and orange and all of the variations of sunlight, that can be really tough to tell. In flight, the common tern, it's really tough to tell them apart in flight, so don't feel bad if you can't do it. Even really great birders, you can't always tell them apart because sometimes you just don't get a good enough look, and that's okay. Not every bird can be ID'd based on the look that you get. So on the common, We're looking on the upper part of the body here, so that back and the wing, the rest of the wing, it's all kind of a similar gray tone. So it's kind of common continuous gray, common continuous. Whereas on the forester's tern, that gray on kind of the middle of the back is darker than what you wind up getting on the rest of the wings. So the forester fades. There's a nice little fade, so darker on the back, and then it kind of fades to white towards the wingtips. Depending on the plumages, there can be variable amounts of little wedges, nice dark wedges, but take a look at that kind of how consistent is the gray coloring on the upper back and upper side of the wing. If you get to see it in good enough light, the common has a gray belly and the forester's has a white belly, but the white belly can look gray if the shadow's in the right place. So that's not one of those ones that's super reliable. Anyway, they're tough to tell in flight, so don't feel bad if you can't ID them. It's not always possible. Okay, we've got two small little wrens that like to live in wetlands, the marsh wren and the sedge wren. As a rule, marsh wren tends to like the deeper wetlands, sedge wren tends to like the kind of shallower wetlands with more sedges and things, but there is broad overlap. The marsh wren has a gurgling rattle that they can vary between song ever so slightly. So let's listen to the gurgling rattle of the marsh wren. It's a little bit more musical, kind of liquid sounding. The sedge wren, on the other hand, sounds like it's got a bit more of a sewing machine rattle. There's a few distinct intro notes and then more of a dry kind of staccato trill at the end of it. So let's listen to the more sewing machine rattle of the sedge wren. And both of these wrens are really, really active, so they're always bouncing around, but they're almost always singing. So they're really great to get practice at hearing because they do sing so often, and they'll sing throughout the day. Once more, let's compare the marsh wren's gurgling rattle to the more machine-like rattle of the sedge wren. So here's the marsh wren. Just doesn't quite sound so much like a sewing machine. Here's the sedge wren. And despite being so active, they can be really tough to get a look at, and they're so small that, you know, focus mainly on identifying them by ear. Similarly, there's a couple of sparrows that really like to nest right there within some of the wetlands. Usually a little bit of the, the shallower areas, wet meadows for the LeConte sparrow, and Nelson's tends wet sparrow into the kind of sedge marshes. But they look incredibly similar. It's only fine details. And like I said in the webinar when we introduced them, I don't know that I've actually ever identified one just by sight. I'm trying to think of one and I can't. It's pretty well always by sound because especially the LeConte sparrow, they sing quite regularly. The Nelson sparrow doesn't sing quite as often, but the LeConte sparrow really does, sing regularly. It sounds kind of like an insect. It's a bit harsher and it goes ticka. So quite a harsh little call, and they call rather frequently. The Nelson sparrow, it's got a much more ethereal, ephemeral kind of quality to it. It is not very loud, so 50 meters away and you can be hard pressed to hear the song even if it's going. And to me, it sounds a little bit like it's going tequila. So let's listen to the sizzly call. compare that again to the Legance, the tick-a-ch. And the tequila. It really isn't an easy one to pick up on because it is it's just barely there for such a short amount of time. So even if you're with someone who's hearing the Nelson sparrow, it might take you a while to actually catch onto it because it's not an easy one to hear. So don't be don't be too concerned. It does happen. Okay, of course, we have various blackbirds, and some of them are super well named, such as the red-winged blackbird and the yellow-headed blackbird. Both of those names are quite descriptive. The thing to remember about the red-winged blackbird, those little red shoulder patches, there is a layer of feathers, along the edge that is a bit yellowish, but depending on how the bird is holding its feathers, you might not actually see that yellowish, or it might have faded to white. So don't stress out too much about, there needing to be nice big red patch and a nice big yellow patch. Sometimes you just don't see the yellow patch, and that doesn't mean it's anything, different. It's just the way it happens to be holding its feathers, or just the way that bird happens to, have its feather patterning. It just doesn't show quite as much yellow, but really, really great names for naming birds. Super descriptive. I love it. So the red-winged blackbird and the yellow-headed blackbird are all back now. Well, not all, but they've started to come back, and you can hear the conkery quite regularly. If you're near anywhere that has water, you will have red-winged blackbirds. So let's listen to the conkery. And blackbirds do tend to be chatty and make all kinds of clucking, and you could hear in that one the little seer call. So just next time you're out in a wetland, just try to listen to all the different sounds the blackbirds are making. There is quite a variety. So yellow-headed blackbird um, has a more musical songs with a little bit of intro notes and buzzes, and a snarl song that just goes wah, and they get into it. They throw their heads back for that one. It's quite wonderful. So let's listen to some of the yellow-headed blackbird songs. So they're quite hilarious. They're quite loud, and they stand out. They're not hiding. They're perched up on the vegetation. So this will be a good one to listen to. To be able to see and hear. Sometimes it really helps to make that association to see a bird and to hear it sing. Of course, we have the ever handsome bobolink, straw patch on the back of the head, otherwise kind of boldly patterned black and white, and they just make the most wonderful robot noises. Let's listen to the R2D2 noises of the bobolink. And these guys tend to like, kind of wet, meadowy areas. And so if you hear a robot coming from a wet, meadowy area, you've got a bobolink. The females look quite a bit different than the males for the most part. The red-winged blackbird female really resembles a sparrow in that you're thinking, okay, a bird that's brown and streaky. The thing that blackbirds all have in common is they have kind of a long cone-shaped bill. So you can see that nice cone-shaped, very pointy bill of the red-winged blackbird female there. She's got a nice white eyebrow, and they can have a bit of reddish around the face, and some of the older females will develop a little bit of color patches on their shoulder. The yellow-headed blackbird female resembles more the male than the other ones do. Kind of a dull brown overall with a reduced amount of a yellow, face and breast color, and they do have a nice little black mask as well. So that's one of the females that kind of, you look at it and you go, okay, I could see that being the female of this species. The female bobolink, however, looks very, very plain, very straw colored, still has that kind of pointy little beak, but otherwise plain, not quite as streaky as a red-winged blackbird, but very, very straw colored. And they're not as showy as the male bobolinks. They're not going to be up there displaying, trying to get themselves seen. You're often hard pressed to actually see the female bobolinks. You have to be watching kind of carefully, and she'll often just be skulking around in the vegetation, but has a nice little pink bill and an eye line that goes through the back of the eye here, but very handsome little bird. Of course, we covered the northern harrier. That is the raptor that you're most likely to see in the wetland, and they tend to cruise low with their wings spread. They have a nice long tail, and they just kind of fly very low over the topography. They'll do this over fields, over wetlands. They'll actually nest in dry areas within a wetland. And males and females do look different, but the thing that they have in common, other than their kind of flight habits and characteristics, they have this white patch at the base of the tail here. So that white patch is, as we've spoken about earlier with the ducks, white really, really does stand out at a distance. So, and because they fly so low over the landscape and they gently like kind of rock back and forth, they kind of cruise, you're gonna see the top of this raptor. You don't always see that with a lot of them that are, circling overhead, but with the northern harrier, you're quite likely to see the back of the bird in flight. So that long tail and that white patch is that really the clue to telling them apart. The males are kind of bluish overall with darker wingtips, and the females and the younger ones are very, very much brown. They look quite um, reddish below, but above they're quite solidly brown. So quite a handsome species. And we do have a warbler that is fond of nesting within wetlands, other habitats too, but they really do like wetlands, is the common yellowthroat. The males, they're quite showy with that black bandit mask. They have a little bit of a kind of white edging on the top, and of course, that bright yellow throat really makes them stand out. And they sing quite a fair bit. They do variations on witchy, 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 or witchity, 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 some sort of variation of that, usually 3.5 to 4 witchies of some type. So let's listen to them here. So some variation of that witchity, 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 witchity. And for whatever reason, me personally, I tend to tune this species out. I don't know why. Sometimes I'll be standing at a wetland and somebody will finally point it out and they're like, it's been going the whole time. For whatever reason, I tune them out. As soon as somebody points it out, it's like, oh yeah. So when I'm doing a point count, I have to remind myself to listen for the witchies. The females, they are quite skulky. They really don't make themselves seen very much, so you're kind of unlikely to wind up seeing them, but they tend to look plain olive overall, and they still do have that kind of yellowish throat. It can be whitish, but the thing is that it contrasts with the rest of the face. So plain face, a little bit of an eye ring, and a throat that is contrasting. It's either going to be yellowish or it can be whitish, but they're both small, very, very active and relatively secretive. But of course, the male, because he's at least trying to sing loudly and maybe be seen, you have more of a chance of seeing him. And that black and yellow combination darting around is quite eye-catching. Whew, I'm going to take a quick sip because we have made it through the birds. That is a lot of birds, folks. Okay, we have a few frogs to cover. And as I have mentioned many, many times when we're going through the frogs, a lot of the base coloration of frogs is quite variable. So I'm just going to point out kind of the more helpful features of identifying the frogs, and then we're going to listen to the calls. You're more likely to hear a lot of these than to see them anyway. Boreal chorus frog, small little frog, and the eye line extends from the tip of the snoot all the way down through the eye, all the way through the flanks and down, and it kind of winds up hitting where the leg joins up. So a nice dark line. They can have roughly what looks like 3 lines down the back, and those 3 lines can either be solid lines, they can be larger blobs, or they can be smaller dots. What it sounds like, though, is it sounds like you're running your thumbnail over the teeth of a comb. And if you get out there, boreal chorus frogs are calling. They tend to call a fair bit, kind of dusk and dawn, but they'll call throughout the day as well. So here's the boreal chorus song. The wood frog, on the other hand, has a dark wedge behind the eye. There is a little dark line going from the snoot to the eye, but that nice big kind of dark wedge that it doesn't run down the side of the body, just kind of that nice dark chunk of brownish, dark looking color. And wood frogs are hilarious. They sound like what you would imagine a bunch of ducks feeding sounds like. So kind of harsh quacks in the wetland. And wood frogs, I see them more in locations that are not really right next to the wetland than boreal chorus frogs. So you're I think a bit more likely to actually run into a wood frog and see it, opposed to just hear it. A couple of other frogs. We have the northern leopard frog, which does have aptly named spots. So they have these little leopard spots that have a halo around the edges of them, and they kind of sound like rubbing balloons together. And northern leopard frogs are a decent sized frog. They're a good sized frog. Spring peeper, on the other hand, they're quite tiny. But for something so tiny, it has just a remarkably loud voice. And if you do get the chance to see them, they are going to be tiny, but they do have some variation of an X on the back of their bodies. And they're so incredibly loud, and if you get a lot of them together, it just can make a deafening chorus of these loud peeps, aptly named spring peeper. And to me, that is just the sound of camping early in the season, back east. It's just you'll hear spring peepers if you're out camping in the early time of year. Tree frogs are neat little species. They kind of look blob-like. If you get to see their little toe pads, they have enlarged toe pads, and that's so that they can just really grip to pretty well any surface, plastic, glass, leaf, whatever. They're going to be sticking to it. They're quite an arboreal species, meaning they spend a lot of time up in trees, shrubs, and on vegetation. There are 2 species, and they are visually essentially identical. Their ranges overlap a fair bit. They vary genetically. The tree frog is diploid, whereas the Cope's gray tree frog has 4 sets of chromosomes. So just a weird speciation there. And this is something that you're much more likely to hear than to see. Of course, you can find them, but they're tough to spot. So here is the whirring of the gray tree frog. You can sort of hear the pulses, and it's on a flat pitch. And the Cope's gray tree frog is a little bit more buzzy. just a little bit more buzzy. You can't really hear the, you know, the notes in the buzz, whereas you can a little bit more in the gray tree frog. But if you just get to tree frog, you're doing pretty good. Let's play that copse just one more time. Of course, we have a couple of toads, the Canadian toad and the American toad. They look quite similar. You know, toads have much drier skin overall, and the best way to tell these two apart visually, looking at the cranial crests, and those are kind of ridges that occur between the eyes. So in the Canadian toad, the cranial crests touch. They kind of just run up and down in between the eyes. You can see them here, and they meet and touch kind of farther away from the snout. So the cranial crests are touching, and there tends to be dark spots with several warts in them. On the American toad, those cranial crests, they don't actually touch, and they kind of frame the eye. They make more of a like a V shape that encompasses the back portion of the eye. And you can see it in this photo here as little cranial crests. And they tend to have fewer warts or bumps in those dark spots. That's just kind of, they tend to. They both sound quite similar, and they have kind of a long monotonous trill, longer than the tree frog. So let's listen to the Canadian toad. Which kind of sounds like some sort of alarm going off. And the American toad tends to have a longer monotonous trill, can be up to 30 seconds long. Chorus frog. Okay, we're getting near the end, folks. And of course, we have the Plains spadefoot and the Great Plains toad. These guys are ones that you are not very likely to encounter. I still have yet to find any. They tend to, you know, be active more at night, and both of them spend a fair bit of time underground, so in loose, moist soils where they're, you know, just waiting out the drier portions of the year. Plain spadefoot has quite large eyes for its body size. It kind of has very bulgy looking eyes. So more of a whirring sound for the Plains spadefoot. So kind of a loud whirring noise. And the Great Plains toad has a long, loud mechanical trill. Quite long indeed. Whew, we made it! We did it! Way to go, folks. So if you want to take part in the citizen science portion of MarshWatch, I invite you to, you know, get the Nature Counts app by Birds Canada. You can register for it on the website, download the app on your smartphone, or you can also print off the data sheet. The data sheet actually has some handy information on the back side of it about, you know, some helpful tips and tricks for some species and telling a few of them apart. And then get out to any wetland you like. You know, if you have IBAs, important bird areas in your neighborhood, definitely those are the kind of places that we're always looking for more information from. So get out, identify and count the birds and note the amphibians. And we discussed this last week, but we're quantifying amphibians in, a call code. So if you don't remember, you can check out the website. The back of the printed data sheet has those codes written out, or you can just review last week's webinar to get a better deep idea for the how to use those codes, and then submit your observations either through the app or through the Nature Counts website. Pardon me. And you can submit other species too. The ones that come up immediately are just sort of the wetland ones. But if you are confident in your other bird species as well, you can go ahead and submit for everything that you're encountering. And you can also check the button that yes, I'm identifying everything I encountered. And if you're just saying nope, I'm still new to this, I'm not don't feel super confident yet, then you don't have to tick that button. You can just say, nope, I'm not reporting everything because there was lots I couldn't identify. So I hope that some of you will take the opportunity to get some MarshWatch checklists, because I sure won't be this year. I won't be getting out doing very much walking at all. So next week, again, brief recap of wetland importance. We're going to do more soundscapes, and we're also going to review all of the plant species, and we'll just talk about how far MarshWatch has come in a short amount of time. Otherwise, that's it for this one. I know it was I know it was quite long, so thank you all for sticking with it. Holy smokes, almost 2 hours. I'm sorry. So my name's Leanne. You can reach out to me at llatchmoy@birdscanada.org. Find Birds Canada on all the socials. We are a national not-for-profit, and if you're in a position to give to charities, we hope you consider us in your giving portfolios. I'd like to say a big thank you to the supporters of MarshWatch that help, keep the lights on, so to speak, and make programming like this possible. That's the Manitoba Fish and Wildlife Enhancement Fund, the Government of Canada, the Saskatchewan Ministry of Environment's Fish and Wildlife Development Fund, as well as Wildlife Habitat Canada, and of course to you guys, because if you guys don't show up for this, then then I can't do them. So thank you all so much for tuning in. It's been an absolute pleasure, and hopefully I can see lots of you next week for the wrap-up webinar.